All right, here it is, the material that we're going to look at for the rest of today. So we've dealt with the course introduction, the syllabus, Moodle, grading schedule, etc., etc. If you have any further questions, feel free to reference the syllabus or send me an email if things don't make sense. Historical method. This is part of what we're going to be doing in this particular course. A good summary is found in Pavlak, page 2. He puts it this way: find a problem, form a hypothesis, conduct research or ask questions of the hypothesis that you've made, make the argument, that's usually written, and then share the knowledge, that's publication. Let me give you a practical example of how that worked out. In my doctoral work, I had to write a dissertation. So I found a problem. I had done some reading in John Stott's life and some of his books. I had also explored the topic of social responsibility and social justice in some other papers that I had written. And so I wanted to discover the correct biblical understanding of how social work and social justice and social action connected with the biblical mandate of disciple-making, Christian mission, and or evangelism. So that was my problem. And I decided to research that inside the ministry and writings of John Stott. So I found a problem, I formed a hypothesis. That basically means a thesis or a way to track an argument, and then I did research. I spent about a year of my life reading everything that he had ever written, reading personal correspondence, traveling to London to do research, listening to sermons that he preached, and then I made an argument. I took all of that research, put it together in argument form, in written form, and turned it in as a dissertation. Now, what Pavlak is talking about in specific is that when we do that amount of research, the goal is to help someone else not have to do that research later. So the reason you publish is not because you have an ego and you want a book with your name on it. The reason you publish is if you've done good research and made a good argument, you're benefiting other people by giving them the research or providing them a way to have access to the research and the content that you've put together. Now, in this course, I'm not going to expect this level of historical work from you. I do want you to see that as a foundation, though, because that's what Pavlak's trying to do in his textbook. It's what Hofecker and the other authors are trying to do in their textbook. And it's really the foundation piece for whatever we're going to do as we explore history. Exploring history is much more than just reading an event and saying this happened then. It's connecting the dots. It's finding out where things came about and why they came about, and some of the processes that led to it. So that's the historical method. Reading and writing from history. Learn to read carefully. This means note the author's background and presuppositions. That's the reason for the extra credit assignment with Pavlak. The more you can find out about him, the less surprised you'll be when you read his textbook. Because if you know who he is, you're going to kind of already know the conclusions that he's going to lead to. Make sense? So note the author's background and presuppositions. You should consider the main points and arguments of the text. So when you're reading through the chapter, when you're reading through the textbooks, you're looking for the main points. What's the goal? What's the author trying to accomplish in this chapter or in this work as a whole? And you should always keep that in mind as you're working through the details. You're looking for the argument. What case is he trying to make or she trying to make? And then you're going to raise questions, concerns, or disagreements. For example, my copy of Pavlak is like this. So I've highlighted and made notes and put questions together. And I would encourage you to do that in your textbook. That way you're working through it in your mind as you begin the process for writing your summaries, etc. Learn to write or argue carefully. It's just a neat paragraph from The Craft of Research it kind of leads us into this whole thought process of looking at history. I don't expect research of you in the class, but research is the total process of making a claim, developing reasons, supporting with evidence, and responding with those with whom you may disagree, and likely concluding with your process of analysis. So research is our interaction with material that then we can write something and present it to others. And it's learning to do that with people with whom you disagree. Good research always deals with people that disagree with you. In some ways, the reality of that is good sermons do that too. Good sermons assume there's a disagreement sitting in the pew. And so there's an argument or interaction. In other words, you're thinking that someone is going to challenge your position. A good forum post is you writing and answering the question, assuming that someone else in your class or even someone outside the class would read that forum post, read that argument you're making, and disagree with it. And so you're not writing to convince yourself, and you're not writing to convince the choir, and you're not writing to convince the professor. You're writing, and you're preaching, and you're speaking, and you're teaching to convince the unconvinced, the person who might disagree with you. And so it really shapes the way that you think and put things together. Learn to write or argue carefully. Yes?
The previous paragraph that you had up there is almost a mirror image of what you do in preparing for and carrying out a debate.
That's right. That's exactly right. Far too much of our preaching and writing is we write for people who just think like us already. And if that's the way you're going to preach, then you're going to preach to a church of 100 people, and they're never going to grow, and they're never going to change, and they're never going to, they're just going to, amen. Brother, that's a sin, and you're talking about a sin that affects people in a different city, in a different location, in a different place. You're not talking about a sin that deals with them. Think about even how Jesus communicated. Jesus didn't preach to make people happy. He preached to convict them. That doesn't mean he was mean-spirited about it. He wasn't, but he preached in ways that really interacted with people's sin life or people's thought life. Think about the Sermon on the Mount. I mean, he said, don't practice your righteousness in front of others, because then you already have your reward. Who do you think he was talking to?
You know, people in
The
this
Pharisees.
in this area think about the use of alcohol as a sin. But if you're in Baltimore or Philadelphia or New York City or any place in the northeast corner up there, people don't think about alcohol as a sin.
Well, you're right about that, and a lot of times preachers preach on alcohol because it stirs up the people in their church. They say, yeah, that's a sin. Bless God, we shouldn't be drunk. Well, drunkenness is not the issue that church is dealing with. Probably hypocrisy and self-righteousness is the issue that church is dealing with. What's sad is when preachers preach against sins that are far removed from the congregation, when Jesus preached against sins that were the people in his congregations or in his audience were dealing with. Which means self-righteousness and pride and ego and those sort of things that are touch points for us. And it's what our churches and congregations are dealing with. And so we want to learn to make good cases. How to write or argue carefully. We discussed this a little bit in regards to the forum post, but this is the process. You make a claim, which essentially is this is your point. This is what you're trying to say is truth or is reality. And then number two, you're going to assemble reasons and evidence. This is where you back it up. You don't just say, this is what is right. You say, this is what is right and this is why. Here's why I think this way. Here's why I hold to this particular position. And then you're going to acknowledge and respond. And this means that you're thinking about your position in light of those who are going to disagree with your position. You're going to respond to them. Technically speaking, in research that happens by pulling in people who already have a differing opinion. So if you're going to work through a topic, say evolution or creation, like we're going to look at in a minute, to really make a good case for creation, you ought to interact with people who hold to the position of evolution. You ought to read their stuff, you ought to read their arguments, you ought to debate their arguments, and in your writing you ought to show that you've interacted with people who hold a position that you disagree with. It's an important part of doing research, acknowledging and responding to those who might disagree with you. Neutrality and objectivity, and this gets at the heart of where we're going to be in terms of this particular class, gets to the heart of what Pavlak is trying to do in his textbook. Neutrality is the idea that there is no bias in your interpretation of history. Neutrality is the idea that there is no bias in your interpretation of history. That's just not the case. All of us bring our own ideas, background, and formation, historical documents, research, textbooks, etc. Every single one of us, when you read Dr. Pavlak, when you read Revolutions in Worldview, when you read the Bible, all of us bring our own ideas, our own background, and our own bias to those documents. We don't come to something completely neutral. That does not exist. Does that make sense? Okay, that's neutrality. That is what some researchers, some historians, and some in the media would have us believe, that neutrality is attainable. That there are some people who can separate themselves so much from their own opinions and thoughts and background that they can look at an event completely neutral. That's just not the case. None of us can look at events completely neutral, or research, or textbooks, or writing, for that matter. Objectivity is different. Objectivity is what we should strive for. Objectivity is the idea that we can honestly and with verifiability interpret history. In other words, one might disagree with my interpretation, but my interpretation meshes with the evidence at hand. Objectivity is not neutrality. It's not the absence of bias. Objectivity, on the other hand, is looking at the material, or looking at the content, or looking at the research, and allowing it to speak for itself, sure, with my interpretation or my ideas, nothing wrong with that, but it deals with the evidence, and all the evidence. For example, when I open up the Bible, I don't open up the Bible unbiased or neutral. I believe the Bible to be God's inspired, infallible, written word. I open it up with that in mind. I have no problem saying that, but that doesn't mean that I can't look at the evidence supporting the truth of Scripture, or even what some would claim as evidence denying the truth of Scripture. Doesn't mean I can't look at that evidence without an objective view of it and interact with it and work through it, just because I believe the Bible to be God's written word and God's inspired word. Yes, I started that framework, but that doesn't mean I'm automatically so overwhelmed by that truth that I can't look at evidence reasonably. I just happen to believe that all the evidence does point to the truth that the Bible is God's written, inspired, infallible word of God. Make sense? So we're all going to bring bias. That's okay. What we should aim for is objectivity. That means looking at the evidence and making a good case for how the evidence fits into the topic at hand. Responding in class forums. When responding, you should be kind to one another, but you should essentially make an argument. You should state your position, and you should defend it with reasons. And interact kindly with those who may disagree with you. Yes?
You probably said this already, but will we have access to this?
I'm going to upload it. Yeah, I'll upload it for you.
Be on Moodle.
Yes. Clarity comes through writing. One of the best ways you can be clear is to write. And so clarity comes through writing. That's why I want you to write. Okay, when you write yourself clear, it comes out much better when you speak. That's why you should write out sermons, because it just makes you more clear and articulate in what you're trying to communicate. Prehistory and historians, this is where we're going to spend the rest of our class time today. Prehistory is basically anything that happened before the proliferation of writing, which occurred about 5,000 years ago. So prehistory is anything that happened before about 5,000 years ago, 6,000 years ago, somewhere in that neighborhood. It means that it's something that is up for much debate in the world in which we live as far as historians are concerned. Susan Wise Bauer, in one of her textbooks, said that any dating before Hammurabi, and his law code was around 1700 BC, is problematic and uncertain. She said there's a variance of about 500 years. So if someone were to say to you, this happened 2800 BC, then according to Susan Wise Bauer, who is a conservative historian, and she's written some textbooks that are wonderful, textbooks I'd like to use for this course, but again, you're looking at about 2,000 pages of reading and much more expensive. But she's a good historian. She makes the case that there's a variance of about 500 years. So they could be 2800 BC, could be 3300 BC, could be 2200 BC. Historians are just not sure because there's not absolute factual evidence to put it at that exact time frame within history.
Dates that are dependent on radiocarbon dating are often said to be within 1,000 years.
Yeah, there's a large variance, which is why the certainty that some would date things in our past is just problematic. And I'm not going to be that certain. I won't be that certain with you, and we'll talk about a little bit of that in just a minute. But Pavlik suggests in a much more certain fashion that we arose from evolution and suggests the lifestyle and means of living for humans in prehistory. Pavlik holds to evolution. That shouldn't surprise any of us, and I'll tell you why it shouldn't surprise us. It's because every historian who writes a textbook, except the ones that are explicitly Christian, are going to hold to an evolutionary theory. Like across the board. I've read world history books, I've read Western history books. Anyone that starts at prehistory is going to hold to an evolutionary theory. That's just what academia holds to. We're not going to hold to that. I realize when you read Pavlik's text and he talks about evolution, I realize that you're not going to hold that. At least I hope you don't. I don't hold that. But we know he holds that, so we need to interact with that. We need to figure out why he holds that, and then how do we respond to that. It's part of what we're going to do in our class. An evolutionary worldview leads to a certain view of prehistory. An evolutionary worldview leads to a certain view of prehistory. Let me ask some questions. I'm going to put some of these on the board if you'll follow me with the camera. What are some presuppositions that may that someone who holds to evolution may have? And a presupposition is this. A presupposition is any foundational argument or foundational thought that one holds to ground their position. So what might be a presupposition for an evolutionist? What might be something they hold that they don't necessarily make a case or argument for, they're not able to defend very well, but it's a grounding thought for their entire worldview. What's a presupposition for someone, an evolutionist? Nicholas first and then Michael.
Man came from monkeys.
Okay, man came from monkeys. And then we're going to do evolutionary. Michael?
I want to say that evolutionists hold to anything that they can predict in the future. They're looking for something that they can, a foundation and something that will lead to a prediction that they can actually, I don't know if what I'm saying is right, where they can actually say that they can predict it and then predict it, and it.
You're talking about uniformitarianism or something like that?
No.
So predictability, let's put that on there. The idea that what happens in the past explains the future.
Right.
In terms of what you look for in science, you can expect to continue.
Correct. Yes.
Okay, so we'll put that. I think it fits. Yes, and remind me your first name. Devin.
Big Bang Theory?
Big Bang. What else?
Kind of an attachment to the man from monkey is life from non-life.
By the way, you are missing the biggest one.
You're looking for no God.
Yeah.
There you go.
Well, that's not. I mean, some people are evolutionists do claim to be Christian or
Yeah, but generally speaking, a presupposition evolution is told is atheism.
Yeah, most of the time.
Because they hold an eternal universe. They would say the universe is eternal, but not necessarily God, or some would hold the universe is eternal. So those are some presuppositions of evolution. Now, on the reverse side, what are some presuppositions for a theistic worldview, or a worldview that says there's a God that started everything? What are some presuppositions you and I may hold, or others who would fall within our camp may hold?
Well,
Obviously.
the God thing is more like they believe that there's no creator. We believe that there is a creator.
So we believe there's a creator. Okay?
Purpose.
Purpose and existence.
That it is a creation from the Creator.
So, creation.
Man's created in God's image.
Yes, created in God's image.
The Bible is the authority.
Yeah, they definitely don't believe that.
Anything else? Okay, I think that'll suffice. All right, let's come back this way. So the next slide is simply what might be some starting points or presuppositions that lead to biblical Christians to make certain claims about prehistory. Now here's the question. Are any of those presuppositions neutral?
No.
No. They're all held with some type of bias. In some way, or in some capacity, they're held with bias because they are not all entirely verifiable by evidence. To some degree they are, to some degree they're not. For example, I think the evidence of the universe is evidence for God, but I can't prove God with evidence. If I could prove God with evidence, I could make everybody a believer. Okay? I think there's plenty of evidence to show God, to depict that God is the creator of the universe, but I can't prove God beyond a shadow of a doubt to every person on the face of the planet with evidence that will guarantee they will believe in God. Okay? On the evolutionary side, the concept that man came from monkeys, that's actually verifiable. It's a presupposition they hold, but it's verifiable. I just don't think the evidence shows it. I think people who hold that are holding that not neutrally. They're holding that because they don't want to believe something different. I don't think the evidence at all shows that. One issue with the predictability, and I think you're right, Michael, I think evolutionists do want to be able to look at the past and then explain what's going to happen in the future. The problem is, what they say is going to be happening now and happening in the future just doesn't happen. How many of you see evolution continuing to take place?
What is that word they use? It's like uniformitarianism or something like that. Some big long word.
Not
Something
sure.
Uni something.
Not sure.
It's the idea that things are stay constant throughout history.
I'm not entirely sure the word that you're searching for, Tyler.
I don't know.
But I do know this, one of the reasons for their incredibly large numbers of the age of the universe is so that they don't have to prove that their theory is continuing to interact with the way the world works. I mean, when you're talking about millions and billions of years, well, none of us are going to live for millions and billions of years, right? And so I'm not going to be here a million years from now. So evolution may extend a million years from now, but I don't have to prove it or verify it because it's not going on today, right? Big Bang Theory. Some physicists came up with the concept of the Big Bang because they looked at the way the universe works and believed that there was a starting point for the universe, that it just kind of started at some point, and they defined it as the Big Bang. ironically, that actually fits a biblical explanation far better than it fits an evolutionary explanation. Because when you read in the book of Genesis 1:1, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, it appears that God gave the earth and the universe and everything that we see a what? Starting point. So, my point is, we don't come at these issues without bias, but we can come at these issues with objective, verifiable, an objective, verifiable sense of evidence. What I'd like to do for the next few weeks in our course is help you see all of the evidence within history, Western history, that gives us a foundation for our worldview and gives us a foundation for how we're to understand the way the world works. And give you essentially